Hi BookTube, it's Roz, and if you visit this channel from time to time, you will know that the end of 2023 and beginning of 2024 have not been quite so brilliant for me, but I really didn't want to miss the opportunity to share with other people some of the joys of my reading in 2023, because it was a really rewarding reading year, even if, you know, in personal terms, the end of the year wasn't great. So, and I'm going to do that in 3 videos. Why 3? That seems too many, Rose, really. Well, you know, I read more than 160 books this year, and some real beauts amongst them. And as you know, if you come here often, I read quite a variety of stuff. You know, very varied reading dad. A lot of contemporary fiction, and I'm going to do one video that's just about my top contemporary fiction reads. I read a lot of stuff in translation, and I'm going to do a video that's my top translated fiction reads of the year. But then, you know, I read nonfiction and poetry and classics and plays, and, you know, so this is my best of the rest video, and I will try and do it in as brisk a fashion as I can manage. And I'm really going to talk about nonfiction, poetry, and classics and backlist novels. I will, in the description, I will make sure I put timestamps so that you can find the bits that interest you in this, and I'll put details. So don't worry if you miss something or I'm not very clear, because it'll all be there if you want to know. Now let's start with nonfiction, and I've read about 30 books of nonfiction, I think, this year, so plenty to choose from. An honourable mention to start with. That is None of the Above by Travis Alabanza. Now, this was not a 5-star read because of in some ways it's quite a raw book, literally, as well as in terms of the writing, as well as emotionally, but just an eye-opening read for me, because Alabanza is non-binary and mixed race and a performer, and kind of draws on all of that to write this book, which is based around 7 things that people say to them or say about them, and they sort of unpick those and respond to them. Definitely a recommendation, even if it's not in my top 5. I read a fair few comics, but I particularly enjoy graphic memoirs, and the one I was most looking forward to this year was Genderqueer by Mayaka Barbe. But the one that actually has got into my top 5 was more of a picture book than a comic, and that was War Boy by Michael Foreman, the children's writer and illustrator. And it's a memoir, or almost a series of memories from his childhood in East Anglia during World War II. And the illustrations are just beautiful, and it has a kind of episodic quality that feels very immediate, you know, rather than sort of an adult looking back. It's more like being there with him as a boy. So that's my number 5. Number 4 is a nonfiction classic, which I'm really, really happy to have finally got to. Silent Spring by Rachel Carson was published in 1962. It was a groundbreaking work of environmental writing. She was writing in a really passionate and also, you know, quite elegant way about the impact of pesticides, the damage that they were doing to the environment and wildlife then, and which sadly, of course, they're still doing today. You know, agrichemicals are still a huge issue across the world. And so, you know, even though it's more than 60 years old, it's still a very relevant book, and I'm really happy to have finally got to it. Number 3 is a slightly kind of niche interest, but there's something about this book that particularly appealed to me, so I'm going to share it anyway. And that's Unquiet Landscape by Christopher Neve. He's a British artist and writer about art, an art critic. And it's a book about British landscape painting from the sort of middle years of the 20th century. You see what I mean about a bit niche. But I think being able to write about the visual arts in a way that brings those pictures, those images, and the work of those artists sort of vividly to life, but to do that in a way that is also art in itself, in literary form, that's special. So that's why this book's in there at number 3. And if you've got the slightest sort of interest in the visual arts, consider reading it. Number 2 is also a bit niche, but in a very different way. Okay, so this book is 13 Colours of the Honduran Resistance by Melissa Cardoza. I read it in translation by Matt Ginsberg Jaeckle from 2016. I came to read it because of my scallywandling personal challenge to read a book by an author from every country in the world, and I wanted to read something from Honduras. I had no idea it was going to be one of my top 5 nonfiction reads of the year when I made that choice. It's a book about 13 women who in different ways were involved in the popular resistance to the 2009 Honduran coup. And if that sounds like that wouldn't be of particularly general interest, I think it is. It's because it's a book about, well, each vignette is about a different woman, and they're different. Some are young, some are old, some are mothers, some are students, some are trans, some are they come from different the different cultural backgrounds that you get in Central America. They all bring that to how they participate in the resistance. And so it's a if you're interested in feminism, if you're interested in politics, if you're interested in Central America, or if you're just interested in poetic, moving and inspiring writing, it's a book to look for. My number 1 nonfiction choice is a more probably more general appeal. Okay, in fact, I know it's of general appeal because it was the top ranked book in the BookTube Prize nonfiction category, and that's An Immense World by Ed Yong. So it's a work of popular science. It's about animal senses, so how different species perceive the world in different ways. And actually, we think of sight and hearing and touch, but animals have other senses beyond those, but even those senses that are the same as ours actually function differently, like eyesight or hearing or smell. Revelatory book for me, and absolutely earns its place as at number 1 because it has that quality of the best sort of factual nonfiction, of combining really good, well-researched content with a lovely, engaging, accessible style of writing that doesn't sort of put off a non-expert reader. So thank you, Ed Yong, for that one. Let's move on to section 2 and poetry. Now, I read at least one book of poetry every month, and had some magic ones this year. An honourable mention is another book that I read as part of my scallywandling, Read Around the World project. And this is a book from a Pacific island nation of coral atolls. Now, when you're finding books from that kind of country, they're not always brilliant because there's not that much available in English. You've got very limited choice, I suppose. So what a joy when you hit one that turns out to be one of your best poetry reads of the year. And that was Jaltok, Poems from a Marshalese Daughter by Cather, Jetnil, Kijiner. Now, these poems are very fine poems from a poetic writing quality point of view. But the other thing about this book was it just really brought home to me what just an appalling experience the Marshall Islands have had in the 20th century, sort of being used as testing ground for nuclear bombs, and now their very existence being threatened by climate change and rising sea levels. So that combination of eye-opening content with really well-written poems was a delight. So it earns its honourable mention. My second honourable mention was more of a booktube experience than well, it's 154 poems. William Shakespeare's Sonnets. Okay. And it's there in my top poetic experiences of the year, because I have been following Too Tight-Lautrec's Shaky Sonnet Show, going through every single one of William Shakespeare's sonnets, reading them. I've read them and then watched Too Tight-Lautrec explaining them in video form on BookTube. I've been doing that for the last few years. It finally came to an end in December 2023. I am bereft that has come to an end, but it gave me an appreciation of Shakespeare's sonnets that I although I knew many of them already, just on another level. So, as an experience, it had to be in there. But let's get to my top 5 actual poetry books. So, at number 5, we have Aurora, Leigh by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the great Victorian woman poet. It's a novel in verse. Novel length books of poetry are not for everyone, I know. But if you are someone who would contemplate reading a novel in verse and a Victorian novel in verse, this is one to read. Browning's poetry is beautiful. She's a great stylist. It's got plot, it's got emotion, it's got great characters. It's a book about self-determination, so a woman's self-determination and artistic self-determination. So there's a sort of semi-autobiographical element in there, I guess. Yeah. My other 4 in my top 5, going in ascending order as ever, are all relatively current. Things from 2020, 21, 22, 2023. At number 4, we have the most recent, because it came out in 2023, and that's Bright Fear by Mary Jane Chan. It's her second collection. Her first was Flesh. She's a Chinese-British queer poet, and she brings all of those identities into her poetry in a quite a special way, I think. Why is it there in my top 5? Because what really makes a poetry collection for me is if a poet brings together form and language with meaning and ideas and emotion in so that all those things mesh and they all matter and they all contribute, and that's what Chan does in Bright Fear. I will say the same for my number 3, and that's A Blood Condition by Kayo Chingonyi. Came out in 2021. I only got to it in 2023. I don't know why, because I loved his previous collection too. He's a Zambian British poet, and he again draws on his various sort of identities to bring that to his poetry. Again, form is really important in the way he writes. There's a wonderful sonnet sequence in the book where the last line of each sonnet is the first line of the next one. I love it when poets challenge themselves around in terms of form and still write beautiful poetry. Some of the best poems in the collection draw on Zambian sort of mythology or traditional religion. To the whole collection, I guess, explores loss and mourning, and death, but from the perspective of an individual, but also for a society or a culture, or beautiful stuff. Number 2 is the first book that I read in 2023, and it's still there in my head, so that's why it earns its place in this top 5. It's called Home Is Not a Place It's by the poet Roger Robinson. His book Portable Paradise is one of my all-time favourite poetry collections of recent years. But he wrote this jointly with Johnny Pitts, who's a writer but also a photographer. They went on a road trip together around the coast of Britain, finding I don't know, really varied ways of being black and British. Kind of not just the urban experience that is sort of perhaps most familiar, and the book kind of grew out of that joint project. So what's my number one? My number one was stellar and mind-blowing. Okay, and that's Nonfiction and Other Poems by Joelle Taylor. Again, it came out in 2021, but I got to see her perform big chunks of this collection at a festival in the summer of 2023, and it was mind-blowing, beautiful, moving, just stunning. And then so I had to then read it as well, and it continued to be emotionally devastating and poetically rewarding in on paper as it was in her performance. It's partly memoir. It's also kind of like a memorial, almost like eulogy in places to the butch feminist community and people that she knew within that, characters within it, kind of real and fictionalized a bit in the 1990s, that were just crucial to her finding her place as a young lesbian woman, and it's dramatic, it's poetic, it's beautiful. I can't recommend it highly enough. Basically, as poetry, it's vigorous, it's almost painfully raw in places, and again, the sort of style and quality of the writing is right up there for me. So moving on from that to backlist and classic fiction. Now, I read a lot of classic and backlist work in English, and I'm probably picking from more than 50 books here. So I had to be pretty brutal in my choices. I excluded all rereads. There's no point in me telling you, how much I enjoyed whichever Jane Austen or Dickens I reread this year, and I've also excluded most of what I read in Victober, although I had a wonderful Victober with some really rich reading experiences, particularly reading new woman fiction. And so, go back and look at the various Victober hosts and videos that were made at the time to find out more about that. But one of my Victober books just had to be in my top 5 because it was a new to me book by an absolute favourite author. That favourite author is Thomas Hardy. The book was The Woodlanders, which he published in 1887. It's typical Hardy in that it's a story about love, and it's, human tragedy, and, there's lots of misery in there. It has a slightly more kind of optimistic ending than many of Hardy's books. But, boy, he puts his characters through the ringer, doesn't he? Why was this one such an exceptional one for me? I think because of the setting. It is, as the title suggests, set in the woods and orchards of an area of Wessex, and that the descriptions of the physical landscape and the wood-based lives of the people in the book just gave it that added quality for me. Number 4 is a book that I read because every summer these days I take part in a booktube event called Faulkner in August. I'm one of the hosts, and we're gradually reading various of William Faulkner's novels, and some have been amazing and some have been just okay. This was one of the best for me, and that was Absalom, which William Faulkner published in 1936. Now, it's a dark book. It's challenging for the reader. I would say, Faulkner's prose is amazing, but quite it's dense, long sentences, repetitions. You get the story, you get versions of a story, and then another version from a different perspective. It's not everybody's cup of tea. I will acknowledge that. But if you are prepared to give it the time and give it the energy that it requires, it pays you back in spades, and is so thoughtful about the American South and the myths of the American South, and in a way that makes it still relevant to read today, when it's about things about the American South 100 years ago. But definitely, give it some thought. Give it some thought as to whether you might like to give that a go. My number 3 is another American classic of the early 20th century, as it happens, and another book that I only came to read because of BookTube, because Hannah of Hannah's Books asked me to read it with her, and that's The Professor's House by Willa Cather. Came out in 1925. It's relatively short. It appears simple, but it's not. It's a multi-layered book about kind of memory and connection and change and not dealing with change. It's a modernist book again, without perhaps superficially appearing to be. Why I loved it so much is because Cather's writing is beautiful at the level of the sentence and the paragraph, as well as the whole. And yes, that was why it was a special pleasure. My number 2 choice also came about as a result of BookTube, the influence of BookTube, because this year I reread or read for the first time all of Ian Forster's novels in publication order, due to the influence of Jen the librarian and Greg of Supposedly Fun, and that was a tremendous experience in a multitude of ways. But the peak, I guess, for me was my first read of Maurice by Ian Forster, and Maurice was written in the period just before the First World War, but was not published until 1971, the year after Forster died. Why? Why was that? That's because he considered it not to be publishable through most of his lifetime, because he was determined to write a book in which a gay protagonist has a happy ending, and he does that, and not just a gay protagonist has a happy ending, but that where he didn't feel obliged to write the gay character in a coded way, or to make them somehow tragic or noble. It's a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, do. And again, Faulkner writes just beautiful sentences, beautiful paragraphs, as well as beautiful books. And I would say the same, even more so, for the book, the author of the book that's my number 1 backlist and classics choice of 2023. And that is Voyage in the Dark by Jean Rhys, published in 1934. Rhys is best known for The Wide Sargasso Sea, which is like a kind of a response to Jane Eyre. She grew up on the island of Dominica and moved to England in her late teens. And the same is true of the protagonist of this book, Anna. So we can assume that there's a semi-autobiographical quality about this book. So Anna finds herself displaced from her Caribbean upbringing and experiencing a cold, grey and unwelcoming England, in which she tries to make her way and struggles, and we follow her struggles to survive emotionally, and her struggles to survive as a woman, and her struggles to survive in love, and her struggles to get by financially, and ultimately her mental health struggle. Now that makes it sound quite a grim book. Actually, it's often funny, it's often I don't know, quite sensual, but above all, it's just beautifully written. Reese is one of those authors that sometimes you read a sentence and you think, I've just got to read that sentence again 2 or 3 times to sort of allow myself to appreciate the words she's chosen, the order she's put them in, and how she's fitted that into this paragraph, this page, this book. So, I can't give a sort of a higher quality standard for a novel than that, can I? So that's my best of the rest selection for you from 2023. If you've read any of them, I would love to hear your opinion of them. And if, having heard those, you think, oh, if Ros loved that, she might love this, do make those suggestions in your comments. And I'll be back soon with videos 2 and 3.